Okay, at the beginning of the semester, I asked you all to think about the most important issue that you thought uh, was facing the country, which is a pretty common um, question in polling data. And so the answers to the right, if I can get rid of this. Sorry. Okay. These were your responses, to the right here, in the blue box. And then the paper topics that you've chosen to write about are on the left, the orange box. Um, I want to compare those to the 2020 election and then going back all the way to 2003. So you'll see that economy, healthcare, and Supreme Court appointments were the top three issues in 2020 as voters went in to vote. Um, and then going back to 2003, it was economy, war, and then terrorism as the top three issues. So, what can we determine about Americans and what they think are the most important issues just from this one slide? Any ideas?
Well, I don't know. I know that the economy is always a major issue with America. It's always like one of the number one things on people's minds when they go vote. But you can tell from the war and terrorism part, and this was 2003.
Yeah.
Well, 2003 was right after 9/11. It was 2 years after 9/11, but still, it's right after. So everyone was thinking about, Osama bin Laden and that whole thing.
Okay, so I want to just correct a couple things because in this class we have to try to do that. Um, the loose language, right, Zach? So this only polled voters in 2020. So voters, people who were registered to vote, identified the economy as the first most important issue, healthcare is second, Supreme Court appointments. In 2003, this one was likely voters because this was feeding into the election. Um, so that's less than 30% of the entire U.S. population. So we might decide that 2/3 of the population don't care about the economy, about war and terrorism, or really about anything at all. Okay. But the other issue is that, when you say everyone, but then I look at your answers as students, as Americans, and you didn't list these things.
Right. Well,
So
I
what?
will
Go
try to
ahead.
be more
More
specific
precise.
with
Yeah.
my language. Yeah, no, I just thought since I was talking in like the, but it's a bad habit. Yeah.
Well, it's a bad habit in school. It's a fine habit when you go to the grocery store. But my point is not, to correct language. My point is here is to look and say that generalization was incorrect. So we have 20 different topics here. What does that tell us about Americans and how they view politics?
We're very divided.
Very divided. What else?
We rely on the government a lot.
Yes, that's clear, right? I mean, it's as if people think that a bunch of elected officials are going to solve all of these problems
Yeah.
and that they don't have any responsibility whatsoever.
hmm
The other thing I want you to think about as we move forward is these are unbelievably broad definitions with the exception of Supreme Court appointments. That's super, super narrow, right? Um, but I don't know what the economy is, and nobody else does either. And you'll never hear economists who study the concept of economics ever speak about the economy. So, what do you think people really mean when they say economy?
I assume, and this is making a generalization for most voters, but I assume when I hear the word that people think one of two things. I think they think the job market. How can they get a job because jobs are very important to people and to a lot of voters and to be more specific, voters and also the stock market.
Okay, so I'd say you were right the first thing, and maybe 5% of the population has any idea what the stock market actually is.
I don't mean the stock market as in like individual stocks, but I mean like you hear the words on the news. The stock market is high. You know, we have the best stock
There you
market in
go,
the
Zach. So
history.
you said it perfectly. The first issue is jobs. How can I get a job or a better job? And the second one is news. And that's largely what's driving most of these issues. So in this class, this is not a class about news, right? This is not a journalism class, and it's not a news media class. And yet, how are people mostly making their decisions? News. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but you nailed it, right? So one thing is very practical, or the material conditions, right? How do I actually get a job? And then the other one is off in abstract land, where nobody really knows what anybody's talking about because they saw it on the news. And obviously not everybody's watching the same news. So one person might see stock market and they say, oh no, this is terrible, the stock market is going down. But people who know about buying individual stocks, that's the perfect time to buy stocks. So two different people are seeing two different things when everybody kind of thinks that they're watching the same thing. And that's really the big issue here for politics, is that when you study in a class like this, and really any political class moving forward, you have to construct a space for problem solving, which means you can't try to construct a space like climate change or crime and violence, right? Because these are way too big. You'll never be able to solve those problems because they're not literally problems. Okay, does everybody kind of understand that first difficulty?
Yes.
Okay. So it's kind of over on here on the right hand side is that, you know, if you were just looking in your empty room, kind of a bad way of saying it, right? But before you moved things into your room, it was empty. And then you constructed that space. And so it's the same thing when you do a research, right? It's pretty much a big empty room, and now you're going to start constructing that space. So you don't want to construct your room with the concept of desk or the concept of bed. You want the actual thing. Does everybody understand that idea?
Yeah.
In other words, right, you're not going to sit there and put a Post-it note on the floor and say, this is where my bed will go, and then lay down in your bed.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have to do the same thing in political science, right? We can't talk about things as if they were imaginative, patterns that we have in our dreams. We have to look at actual problems. So actual problems always include actual humans. And I hope that that's the thing that you remember. You have to talk about humans when you're talking about a problem. You're not talking about climate change. The climate does not have a problem with change. Humans have a problem with climate change. And then we have to start narrowing down which humans are we talking about. Largely in political science, you want to write this down as well, we're usually talking about voters. And again, that's only about 30% of the population in America. So we're discounting 70% of the population most of the time when we're talking about politics. Now this might be a pop quiz. Which view of participation is that? Is that the elitist point of view, the pluralist point of view, or the constructionist point of view?
So we're discounting what percent of the population?
70%.
That's an elitist view.
That's an elitist view.
Yeah.
So political scientists tend to support the elitist view of politics.
70%.
70%, right? Okay.
Wow.
The next part is what you're all kind of going to be doing over the next few weeks, which is you need to get enough data to identify a pattern. So I might just pause there. And what do you think that means?
Well, perhaps finding information that correlates to other information and
You were so
trying
close,
to find
Frank.
somewhere you could tie those dots or connect those dots.
The only problem is that you're doing it backwards. So
All
first
right.
you have to find the information, and then you have to find enough information. Then you try to coordinate and you try to connect the dots. So that's a huge difference between how we live our quote unquote regular life and how we actually do political science. So let me give you an example. Let's say you are going out to date. Okay, you're going to start dating somebody, and you go onto one of the dating apps. What prohibits you from collecting 1,000 profiles? What stops you from doing that?
Well, sometimes the app does.
Always the app does. Now, why does the app do that?
I don't know. I don't use dating it. Because I don't know.
Because then you'd have the app and you'd make the money, right? So, in other words, you got the problem, right? In our everyday life, we don't have access to data. So we can't tell if people are lying on a data app, whether they're using multiple data apps, right? We don't have any of that information. We don't know how much money they really make, right? We don't have any of this information, and so we can't make very good decisions on a data app. I might say the same thing about the bank, right? You don't have the same information that the bank has. We don't know how much information your bank or how much money your bank is investing into the stock market, into bonds, into loans, right? We don't have that information. So in our everyday life, it's very logical to not try to collect a bunch of data. Instead, to do exactly what Frank said. You want to quickly coordinate what data you do have so you can make decisions. Has anybody ever gone to dinner with a group of people and people can't decide who's going to pay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now imagine I suddenly could show you all of their profits, their liabilities, their debt, right? Their bank statements, their family background. You'd be able to make a much better decision on who should pay.
Right.
Everybody gets this? So we're really bad. Humans are really bad at trying to make these decisions without data, but we do it all the time. So that's kind of the probably the hardest part for students going from everyday life now into, political science or social science or sociology, is that your teachers, me and Professor Parker, we're used to doing this all the time. This is brand new for you, right? And so I think the next part, which is a logical question for all of you to ask, is, well, so what's the right kind of data? How do I know that I have good data versus bad data? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm
Yeah.
not going to, torture you here, right? We're just going to go, we have opinions, and that's what we're used to in the everyday world. We have secondary sources, we have primary sources, and then we have scientific facts. Now, I put this in the order of how common the information is in our society, in American society. If I go to a different society, if I go to a different culture, we might organize this data differently. Germany, for example, is more prone to scientific facts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we'll analyze someday why that is. But America is, probably because of the First Amendment, people think that they have a political right to their opinion, and so they exercise that right all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And probably nobody on the quote-unquote news would be there if they weren't allowed to talk about their opinion all the time. And if you think I'm wrong about this, watch the weather report. The person giving the weather will throw in a bunch of their opinions about all sorts of things, about what plants you should bring inside, about whether this is a good day or a bad day, right? So opinions are everywhere, and they're really kind of the mortal enemy of college. Because if all we did was play around with opinions, what would be the point of paying for school?
Right. But wouldn't a better metric to decide or to look at this would be like, how do people, what majority or what, how to phrase this? Like, for example, you have an opinion. So let's look at how this person's opinion came to be. Did they get it from a secondary source, a primary source, or scientific fact? And then you could look at it and say, well, majority of it came from opinion, from a secondary sources, let's say. most people look at the news to get their facts. There's only a handful of people who look, at like who are reading some textbook where the guy wrote the original. Well, even textbooks are secondary sources.
If not just opinions.
Right? Yeah, if you get them from like Texas. So
well, my dilemma in answering this question is twofold, right? I don't know that you know the definitions to the next three phrases, right? Because we haven't talked about it. And then secondly, are you going back in order here? Let's go back to number one. Are you suggesting that there's a problem with how people make their decisions based on information?
Yeah.
Right, so that's the problem, right? So then do we have enough data to identify a pattern of the problem? Right now in this conversation.
Right now, no.
No. So this is that bad habit, right, that we're always in our everyday life. What we need to do as good social scientists is to write that question down, and then now we'd have to go seek out the data. Now, I should feel some frustration from, there's only 3 people here, but what would be frustrating about that?
You don't have a large spread of opinions and ideas.
Good, right? In fact, you want to reduce the number of ideas and opinions to as small of a space as you possibly can. That is very different than in our everyday lives, right? We judge people based on how many opinions they have in regular life. In college life, we are starting from the assumption that no one really knows anything. And that's why we're in college. That's why we're studying these things. If these things were self-evident, we wouldn't be here. So let's get into this idea. What is a secondary source, Zach?
The news, specifically it's anything that does not come directly from the actual source. Like, I guess to explain, I would need to say what a primary source is. Like, a primary source would be if I got hit by a car and then somebody asked me how I felt getting hit by that car. And then if that person turned around and told someone else, that would be a secondary source.
So that's not bad, but that's not how we academics think about this. So the first thing, you said if you got hit by a car, what would be the scientific fact? The scientific fact is that you'd be injured.
Yeah.
Your opinion would be how you feel. If I operated on your brain, I might get some scientific facts about how that emotion was created. But I don't really care what you have to say, because what you say is not a primary source or a scientific fact. So primary sources for us in social science are almost always texts. So for example, the Green New Deal, that is a primary source. The Constitution of the United States, that is a primary source. Secondary sources tend to be what you just said. It would be an interview or oral narrative that has been translated or analyzed by the academic. So basically, a primary source is the thing that an academic is going to look at, and then the secondary source is their analysis of that primary source.
Yeah, no, I meant like, my opinion would be like it hurt, but I'm saying if that person were to now tell someone else, they would be a secondary source, not that I would be a primary source.
Incorrect.
They wouldn't be a secondary source?
They would not be a secondary source.
Does a secondary source have to be based off a primary source?
A secondary source has to be based off a primary source.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
And more, what Professor Parker is trying to get you all to think about is that secondary sources should really be based in scientific fact when you analyze a primary source. So you have to go all the way back to the beginning of this researching social issues by saying, is there a problem about the way you're describing how emotions are made? And the answer is yes. And Lisa Barrett, a neurologist, you'd have to read her book to help you understand that the way you're talking about how emotions are made is not how emotions are made. So this gets very kind of complicated, and so for the context, you need a good analytical theory before you can ever do this work really well. I'm going to help you with that process. Nobody's expecting you to be able to be an expert at this next week, or that it's just going to sink into your brain and suddenly you're going to be able to do it. Our job in these 3 classes is to help you get better at this so that you can continue practicing it. But before I can go to the next thing, I have to ask, well, so how come not just experience alone? So Frank, if you want to think about this, why is experience not good enough for climate change, for example?
Well, it's more of a scientific study, and it's not really something you can just ask about how it's going.
Right.
You have to rely on all sorts of, like I said, scientific studies to find out the information you would need to know.
And this is like largely why people are critical of Darwin, right? Is that Darwin mostly measured plants. And so he made a few comments about humans as speculations. And his argument was saying exactly what you're saying. We would have to go out and experience all these things in order to really understand it. I mean, it would be awesome if Frank and I could go around the world experiencing climate change. But that would take a while. And so 30 or 40 years from now, Frank and I could write an essay on our experience of climate change. And that would be primarily a pretty good primary source, assuming that we were taking photos, videos, and including our scientific facts and our lab results.
Yeah.
So secondary sources are helpful to kind of think about the primary sources and scientific facts that already exist in the world, so that Frank and I don't have to go out and recreate scientific facts. So especially on climate change, the challenge here is we need a good analytical theory. The melting ice caps might be a bigger problem for people in South America than it is in North America. But we need an analytical theory to make that prediction. And that will come through a secondary source. So I'm just going to...
That makes sense.
So a lot of the big problem that most of you are having when it comes to politics is that you have this mental model that no change is possible. But if I look over here to the right, every year Congress passes hundreds of laws, hundreds of bills. And already this year, up till just, about a week ago, they've already passed 7. So it's not so much that Congress can't do anything. They're constantly doing things, but they're clearly not doing what you want them to do. And now I'd have to go back to this constructing a space. Is this an actual problem? But then again, that would depend on your theory of political participation. So I'm going to go through these really quickly because I have examples in the PDF. But basically, this is the elementary version of what most of your teachers might give you. They'd say, go to a site like CQ Researcher. And this is okay. This is not the worst thing in the world because they're aggregating, they're collecting a bunch of news summaries. But they're also including bill proposals and a fairly intelligent summary of the positions of people in those proposals. So this is a great place for you guys to start, largely so you can start thinking about other people's positions. So moving beyond your own opinion. And you can see, over here on the right, they have hot topics: abortion, climate change, college debt. Abortion did not come up in most important issues or in any of your issues. So, it's a problem, but this is kind of how opinions and secondary sources come together, is that somebody is going to have to guess what they think is an important or hot topic. After you've done research like this, you'll start to have a clearer idea of what you're looking for. So now you want to go to establish secondary sources, and that database is called JSTOR. This is what I use, what Professor Parker uses, and this is what they call a literature review. So this is basically collecting the analysis that other scientists and social scientists have done. And so now you don't have to recreate those lab experiments. You don't have to go back and identify all the primary sources. People have already done this for you. Now, sometimes students will ask, well, what's the big deal? Basically, it's really, really hard to get published. Okay, so anytime I send out an article or Professor Parker sends out an article to get published, at least 3 people in our field are going to review that submission, and they're looking for mistakes, they're looking for errors, and they can reject the article. So this is very different than the news source. The other idea here is that these are not for profit, and so they don't have any profit motive to publish bad articles. So these are the 4 steps that I have to take when I'm going to publish an article. It has to be based on a gap in the literature. So I can't just restate something that somebody has already said. I have to say, well, this is an area that hasn't been covered yet. That's mostly where I want you all to focus on, right? There's climate change, for example. It'd be really good if you would focus on your generation and children, because there's a gap in that literature, right? People have mostly studied the 50-year-olds, what's called the baby boomers. I don't know, they're going to be dead soon. Let's be serious. So what we really want to know is, how do children think about climate change? How are they understanding it? What information is being presented in elementary school? So that's a gap in the literature. Not too many people are thinking about that. You also have to use acceptable methods of analysis, which Professor Parker and I are going to teach you. You have to use a correct structure. That's largely what you're learning with Professor Ulmer. And then you have to say something, right? So saying the world will never change, that's not something, right? You haven't added anything. Now, primary data is the hardest one to work with. If you all want to get into this, I'd be happy to help you. This is the raw data. It's the actual legislation. It's committee reports. Zach, it's like we talked about, like watching C-SPAN all day. You also get to see objections, witnesses, all this extra information. The problem is it's not quick, it's not simple, and it's not a meme. You're not going to be able to turn any of this information into a clever slogan. It's going to be very complicated and a lot of work. So, this is probably not something you're going to do in your first year. You'd probably do this if you were a junior or a senior. But if you want to play around with it, this is the time to do that. So the big issue I think you mostly have is, how come not the media? I might start with Dr. Dre. Likes don't pay bills, right? Just because somebody sees a meme doesn't mean they're going to change their behavior. In fact, with the exception of the Trump election, and there's a lot of interesting information on that, people generally don't pay attention to social media. This is because of this point to the right. People are contradictory about how they feel about media. They think it's both positive and negative. I'm sure their opinion is correct here, but that kind of canceling out leads them to do nothing. So the reality is, for those who have studied what's called political communication or news and politics, is that the only time that news is influential is during this time called a window of opportunity. And that's when the problem stream, the policy stream, and the political stream all come together. So let's use that example of the World Trade Center attack, because you brought it up, Zach. So the Patriot Act was passed during this time period, during this window of opportunity. So the problem was terrorism, as broadly defined, and people were scared. The policy was already ready because law enforcement had been complaining about this problem for over a decade. And so they said, here's our information. Let's go ahead and enact this policy, the Patriot Act. The politics of the moment was that nobody wanted to be seen as being pro-terrorists or anti-defense. So Democrats, who ordinarily would have said hell no to this legislation, were quiet, and they voted for it because they didn't want to lose in the next election. So policy entrepreneurs, which at this time were people like Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, the experts on policy within the government, were able to package this in a way and then repeat certain phrases through the media. This is how there was pressure put on politicians using the media. So the media becomes a tool, but only when these moments come together. So can anybody think of one that's happening right now? There's a pretty big moment that is presenting a window of opportunity.
In Texas, they just legalized open carry.
Right, you just
without a
nailed it.
license.
Guns, guns, and guns, right? So
Yeah,
it's
it's the
hard,
easiest topic to talk about.
and it's hard to see which direction this is going to go, because from the last election we know that half the population is pro get as many guns as you can, and the other is terrified of guns. And so we're going to have to pay attention to what are the messages that policy entrepreneurs like the National Rifle Association are trying to deliver through the news. And I can tell you it's very clear what they're doing. They're trying to link gun control with this threat of an invasion of migrants. And so whether that will be successful, that's why I've got the kid from the Ring here. It depends on how many people are glued to their television and whether they're afraid, about this particular issue that they don't know anything about. The other problem is that 6 companies own the entire media in the United States. So this is like a very good example of sociology. Reporters work for a wage salary. They report to the editors. Those editors report to a board of directors. The board of directors has one job, and that's to increase profits. Shares on the stock market mean that you can buy into a percentage of the company. That company is owned by another company, and then company C, in this case Comcast, AT&T, CBS, Viacom, 21st Century Fox, and the Disney Corporation own all of those other companies. So those 6 companies are competing with each other to try to get views. So here's how they do it: sex, scandal, violence. So every story that they ever tell on the news has to fit into one of those frames. Everybody understand?
Mm-hmm.
It's so pathetic that again, going back to the weather, sometimes you'll see very clearly that they're selling sex through the weather. Sometimes they'll make a joke about a political scandal and attach it to the weather. The only reason they're doing that is because advertising is going to follow right after that. And guess what you're going to see in the ads? Sex, scandal, and violence. Everybody's good on this so far?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, Zach, one thing that you brought up is, a common misunderstanding. Socialism and fascism can be different, but they're not necessarily different. So the National Socialist Party in Germany, the Nazis, were a fascist socialist party. There's also been fascist socialist parties in Yugoslavia, in Malaysia, in other places. The way that they become fascist socialist parties is by using advertising techniques through a state-owned media.
No. Socialism and fascism they could interlap. They could also be different, but communism and fascism, by definition, have to be different.
No, they don't. But maybe by popular opinion definition as opposed to political definition.
Well, yeah, as in most people think of communism and they think of Stalin, or actually, I say most people, but most people aren't thinking about it.
But Stalin would be a
it.
great example of a fascist communist.
Right, but I feel like communism has never actually been implemented at all, because all the times that it's ever been used has been under a dictator, like in North Korea or Russia.
Well, that misunderstands the goal of communism. Communism is not a political doctrine, it's an economic doctrine. So it'd be correct to say communism is the opposite of capitalism. You understand?
True, right. Fascism can't line up with communism because they're not. One's an economic idea, one's a political theory.
Capitalism and communism are opposites, not fascism.
Right.
In other words, these isms get confused through the media. Because it really depends on, and this is really what you're trying to get at in your sociology class, it really depends on the economic system. All those phrases are going to take on different meanings depending on which economic system you're in. The point here is that this system is what's producing bad information. So I'm going to give you an example from one study I did with a colleague about fake news and media. We looked at secondary sources of folks who were looking at the primary source of the IP addresses and how the information is shared through social media. So folks who believed in fake news or deliberate disinformation had social networks that you see over here on the right side. So basically, any information that comes in that's different than what they already believe is immediately rejected because it doesn't fit their value system. But what's more important is they don't have anyone disagreeing with them. So they reject it outright because it doesn't fit their values. But then they hear from somebody in their network that they also rejected it because it doesn't fit their values. So that person says, oh, I must be right because someone else agrees with me. Does this make sense? Is there anybody out there?
Oh yeah, I was nodding.
So on the other hand, people who aren't changed, they don't change their behavior based on fake news, they have the opposite system. They're constantly getting different opinions from different people, and so they're having to figure out who they're going to believe. So if we simplify this, one side is a monological information system, where a bunch of people giving monologues, if you think like Shakespeare and in, like theater, whereas the other one has a dialogical information model. It's generally skeptical of new information, but it's willing to engage in feedback. And so when that feedback starts building, people start having a better understanding of information. So the difference is this, really, when it comes down to it. The QAnon kind of cult logic that they have now is this basic phrase, where we go one, we go all. Where we go one, we go all. I want you to think about the grammar of that sentence.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, I know what it's supposed to mean, but that's completely incorrect.
You just said it well, right? It's what they think it means versus what it must mean in logical scientific fact. Logical scientific fact means they are doing a mass suicide because everyone dies. So the only thing that we could all do together would be die.
Right.
We can't do anything else scientifically together. I mean, we could try, but at the end of the day, it's not going to work. Versus Alice in Wonderland, where Alice says to the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go? As if somehow there's a we go. The Cheshire Cat says, well, where do you want to go? Immediately dismissing her, right? Creating a dialogical model. We don't share a direction. We don't share a monologue. And so she says, well, I don't know. And then he says, well, it doesn't much matter. And that's meaning the scientific definition of that word, not the moralistic. So in other words, there is no information being produced if you don't know where you are going. That is exactly correct with these monological information models. No information is being produced. One concept is being shared, and that's it. So how does this occur in the media? There's two sources. The old school news just aggregates the information. And that's what you were really asking at the beginning, Zach. What if we just counted all of the bad information that people have and accepted that? That is generally what we do in everyday life. And we do it all the time, right? I'm not even going to give you how many examples, right? But you could have like such and such movie is the biggest blockbuster in the history of the world. Does that mean it's good?
Right.
But
no, it's only the eye of the beholder.
But what do? We run out and go see that movie just to the case because maybe it's good.
Right.
Same thing.
Like when people say, like hey, have you seen, I don't know what movies on in theaters now, but Godzilla? And they're like, oh, I've heard it's good, right?
You just nailed it, right? I've heard it's good. That's that monological idea that somehow we can share a concept or we can share a value. So it's not quote unquote bad that we do this because we're surrounded with it. So socially, it becomes a norm, it becomes an expectation. But I might remind you, I don't know if this is a coincidence, but less than 35% of the US population has a college degree.
Wow.
So going to college means that you're going to be exiting one set of norms and entering into another one. And I think you all are young enough, but as you get older, this will start to have a difference in your social groups. People who end up going through college and people who don't have very different ways of seeing the world. The other issue is probably more complicated. This one is the algorithm of opinions. So, my friend was talking about this actually this morning. She said what fascinates her about Facebook is she hears about these things at Kingsborough, like QAnon, but she never sees them on Facebook. So I explained to her, that's because you don't click on this information. So the algorithm isn't created for you. This is what creates these circles, is that people who only look for information that they know to be certain and agree with their value system, they're just getting more and more and more of the same thing, which means they think, they're getting better information. But this is like saying that the more beer you drink, the better looking you are.
Right.
But there are people that will go into the bathroom over and over and over again after drinking beer after beer after beer and say, man, I'm good looking. This is the same problem, right? The more feedback that you get that is the same, the more likely you are to be confident. And this is a particularly human problem. We're really bad at this. But remember, none of this information in news media or in social media is a primary source.
Right.
So this is really where it gets super, super complicated. I can't reach the button.
Wow, that's a lot.
So let me just, oh man, I can't let this other student in. Oh well. It is a lot. So let me try to go back. This is like the big board or the matrix. I mean, I'm trying to show you everything at once, so there's some rhyme to the reason. We want to go from up to down. So basically, I had you start with the social problem. Bad news for me is most of you turned them into an I problem, not a social problem. So it was your problem, not our problem. Now,
yeah, because I viewed it as a letter to myself, so I was like, it's a me problem now.
So a lot of this goes down also to what you're learning in the sociology class, right? Is that you're looking at systems that have relationships. So I understand why you're looking at it the way you're looking at it. The problem is that it led to generalized solutions. So certainly it's a problem for you, but the solution has to be more applicable. And it has to fit within one of those patterns of politics, because not everybody's going to agree with you. So we have to move over to a structural view as opposed to a theory of the mind. So we have to stop looking inside of people's minds and trying to tell them, listen to me, I have the solution. What we have to do is try to analyze relationships and try to see what is the most effective strategy of getting people to behave a certain way, not think a certain way. So the second layer of problems was that, well, the media and advertisements give you prepackaged solutions, right? Like come together. So that doesn't tell us anything about how we can create structures of coming together. So this bottom part is the systemic nature. What you have to do is you have to start picking relationships. So let me move from right to left. At the end of the day in political science, the most likely person to implement your solution will be a bureaucrat. So for example, if you say, I want undocumented immigrants to be able to get an ID in New York City, the person at the DMV is the person who's going to implement that policy or choose not to. And so that's where you should really start. What is the closest bureaucrat that can actually deal with this problem that I'm thinking about? Moving over then, you have to make a decision, is Congress or the president more likely to implement your solution? The president really, despite what is portrayed in the media, has very little power and very little influence, meaning they don't do much. I think Trump invented a really fascinating power with his tariff strategy. And that was largely because I guess nobody wanted to take him on, including the Congress. Several people in Congress said he can't do that, but then they didn't do anything to try to stop him. So you have to kind of think about, is Congress or is the executive branch a good place to implement your solution? That's really going to go back to that CQ quarterly. Try and see, what do the secondary sources have to say about this? Sometimes a judge is the right place to go. Sometimes bringing a lawsuit is the right place to go. So you want to think about that too. Sometimes you don't want to go to a bureaucrat because they already aren't doing the thing that you want. You don't want to go to Congress because they already passed a law and that doesn't seem to make any difference. You might want to not go to the president because this president doesn't support your policy. So you might want to go to the courts. But courts are pretty restricted in what they can do. So when you get into politics, I used to work in political campaigns. The reality is, on the local level, the party chair is the same thing as the party chair at the national level. That person has the most influence within a political party, even more so than the Congress people and the president, because they raise money. Does that make sense? Is anybody there?
Yeah.
So this person is fairly easy to find. But you just want to look for the chair of the Republican National Committee, Democratic National Committee, or the chair of the Democratic Committee within New York City. And that person has a lot of influence. Now, the governor and the legislature, that's the same thing as Congress and the president, but at the state level. You have to think about, is your solution probably more likely to be implemented by the state or by the federal government? The answer is always going to be the state. It doesn't mean it's the best solution, but it's more likely to be passed at the state level than it is at the federal level. There's just too many people that can block your solution in the federal level. That's the concept of federalism in practice. So you take the theory of federalism and now you practice it. There's too many layers within the federal government that can stop your solution from happening. And usually for really bad reasons, like their district isn't going to get any money from your solution, so they vote against it. The state level is a little bit more likely than the federal level because there's fewer people who can block you. You still have the same problem, right? As Professor Parker said in your class, if your idea is going to take money away from people up north, then they're going to try to block you in the state legislature. So then you want to narrow down and say, well, maybe Mayor de Blasio or the next mayor, which is what your assignment is in Professor Ulmer's class, is the most likely place. Try to always think about the mayor with the city council, though. It's very rare that the mayor can do something that they don't get support from the city council. But it's also very rare for a mayor to be elected in New York City without the support of the city council. So they generally come from the same political point of view. You also, though, want to think about maybe the borough president, like Eric Adams. And that would be interesting, right? Eric Adams is the Brooklyn Borough president. So if you live in Brooklyn, then Eric Adams would be the best person to implement your solution in Brooklyn and in New York City. If you live in Queens, it's not so helpful. The other issue is the CEO, right? As you're seeing, corporations are involved in politics. Some people are complaining about that, but they've always been involved in politics. So the CEO has more influence than the employees, the manager, or the board of directors. They also have influence over the political process. So if your issue has something to do with the economy, then a CEO is going to be much more influential than a mayor. Now, if you're talking about something like stop and frisk, police brutality, the community board is going to be by far the most logical place for you to try to get your practice implemented, because there's fewer people that can interfere with your solution. So if you say the community board, I want community policing in this area, it's more likely to happen. Now, these last three are just kind of examples that relate to your sociology class. So in the family, there's the archetype of the family member. Now, that could be the father in some of your families. It could be the mother. In other families, it's an uncle, or it could be a grandmother. Everybody kind of gets, it could be you, right, in some families. That person has the most influence over their family. In your friend circles, there's an archetype, right? There's somebody who, and by the way, there's no such thing as an alpha male, so I'm using archetype as opposed to alpha male. So the person who has the most influence in your social circle, right? That's who you'd want to go if you want to implement your policy just within your own social circle. And then finally, there's a provost and a college council. That has the most influence, and that's who you'd want to direct if you're trying to change something at Kingsborough. The challenge for us educators is try to create this space for you where you can start to identify the patterns and then critically analyze them for the first time. That's what this is. And again, it's a lot of information. But these are the things that you have to think about as you're going through this class. If you are pushing for a social movement, Zach, like what we talked about, you have to remember that there's competition within society, right? So I'm doing a panel, hopefully, with my friend who is the director of Wild Tomorrow Fund. And she rightly complains that, people are more likely to give money to their religious organization, which mostly pays for like the electrical bills for that religious organization, than to the environment, right? To environmental fund. So this is the reality of social movement organizations. How, you might support animal rights. You might say on Facebook, I love animals, but are you donating a significant portion of your income? Are you volunteering for them? And this is the challenge of social movements, right? Is that people often say they support something, right? They say Black Lives Matter. They might even go to a protest, but they continue to participate in racist environments, right? Oftentimes without even accepting the fact that they're participating in them. So that's one problem with the social movement sector. The other side up here is up here at the top, a sociology of government. There's three patterns of behavior that people generally, I might say, fall for. So let's start with the one I'm talking about in this class. Bureaucracy is the thing that's most likely to be able to make a change. So let's say I'm wondering, I was supposed to get paid for some extra work I did, and I'm wondering where that money is. The bureaucrat is the person I can definitely get the answer from. I can just email the person in payroll and they'll tell me what the issue is, how much I'm getting, and when it's going to be delivered to me. Okay? It's not because of the person, right? Mary might be a very fine person, but it has nothing to do with that. It has the fact that she has the role, she has the office where she can see that information. She has access to that data. But I might want to talk to somebody who's going to get me my money faster, right? And Mary won't do that because her role doesn't allow her to do that. So I might think about who's the most charismatic person in that office, and can she put pressure on Mary to speed my paycheck along? And if any of you have ever worked, right, there is usually a charismatic person that can do this, meaning that their behavior is such that they can influence people to do something that they might not otherwise do because it doesn't say that they can do that in the policy or in their employee handbook. And then less likely, but probably true in most families, is this traditional source of authority, which is that it's always been this way. Or as my father would say, because I said so. My dad didn't invent that phrase, right? He heard that from his dad, who heard it from his dad, who heard it, and you see how this works, right? Now, the final point to think about is that money is usually a bad answer in social science, but it is a good answer when it comes to getting the government to do something. Governments have two sources of revenue. The one is taxation, right? Getting money from people. But the other one is the ability to print money. The problem is by printing money, which they've printed trillions of dollars of money, that leads to inflation. So that means milk costs more, bread costs more, certain items that we can identify. But the other issue is really, where is this money going to get spent? So, Zach and Frank want money to go into climate change, right? But other students in this class want money to go into healthcare, or they want money to go into the immigration system. Well, so every dollar that goes one way means that you're pulling it from somewhere else. And then the biggest bad news of the whole thing is much of the budget is spent already. So there's already money having to go to the military and the wars that we're involved in. There's already money going to the debt. There's more money going into maintaining roads, airports, security, all this stuff. And then Trump's border wall. And then the worst part is the Iron Triangle. The people who are asking for money used to work in the government, and now they work for private corporations. So you can kind of see the problem here. Okay, that's enough information for now to get you started.
Yeah.
But you see how much more complicated it is and why the research process is what it is, right?
Yeah. Could we get these that slide, like all this information was a lie, and
Absolutely. And I'm going to share this recording